think I've had them like this. So in order to be completely unbiased, I'm going to do it like this. And because, you may be like, well, why does he always have the blue hat on the against side and the red hat on the for side? So now you're good. No complaints. Not that anyone's complained yet, necessarily, but how in the world do we navigate the space that we're in as Christians, in particular when it comes to politics? If you're new with us today, we are going to talk through some political conversation. If you are just kind of joining us in this series, the tension really gets down to what does it look like to follow Jesus, to be united to Jesus in a politically divided world. We happen to be in the United States in a politically divided environment. This is where we are. Part of that is by the nature of the system. I believe in the beautiful thing we call democracy. In the United States, it's different from some of the other countries that have democracies in the world. We are a bipartisan democracy, meaning we have two parties that control the power, Democrats and Republicans. We have other parties, but it's not quite the same as other countries that have full-fledged democracies where you can split among those parties. We have created this space where it's divided, and then what happens in Christian circles, especially in America, we begin to identify more as Americans who are Christians than Christians who are sent to America. And when we do that, the influence of our culture begins to take over. When I identify as American first, then I can start to split down what that looks like. Well, not all Americans are one side or the other. It is divided. And so you go, where do I fit? And what happens in a politically divided world, we start to feel entitled towards our position, right? So if I'm right leaning, or in this case, left, which confuses everybody, if this is where you are in that red state Republican dynamic, conservative thinking, whatever, you're going to feel like everybody opposed to you is wrong. And if you're on the other side of that argument, that those people are wrong, and you start to figure out where in the world do we start to make decisions, and how do we get to this place of division? Well, what happens is we start to divide. We start to ask questions about these hills and which hills are worth dying on, because you will find people who will die on every hill. And what I mean by that is mentally, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, we will align ourselves with certain issues and draw a hard line in the sand, so to speak, and that becomes our issue, right? I mean, you think about where we've been over the last, let's take 8 years, in the abortion conversation, right? I mean, it has been like the key voting twist for a lot of people on moral issues. And so abortion has become a political hill that Christians are dying on. No matter how you feel about the issue, abortion becomes one of those very deeply entrenched subjects. And so we start to divide over the issue of abortion. And we go, this is a hill I'm going to die upon. Maybe for you it's the economy, maybe it's healthcare. The phrase that is used is women's health. You've got all these different pieces, and we start to decide what hills we're going to die on. And then maybe you're with us today, and you're online or you're in the room, and maybe you don't have a faith relationship with Jesus, and you're hearing this kind of conversation, and you go, well, I've watched people who claim Jesus to be king or a part of the church or whatever, and they haven't really behaved like Jesus people should, and so I'm not real for sure what that looks like, because they're dying on these hills, and to do so, they're crushing people along the way. And that's kind of what happens, right? You fight over these issues. So what hills are worth dying on? Let's kind of wrestle with this conversation this morning. We get here by asking this question, right? This is how we start to navigate these hills and what goes on. We begin with the tension of, is it correct or incorrect? Like, this is like your spelling test, right? Do you ever have to take spelling tests in school? When I was younger, I could have been a straight A student had it not been for handwriting. Why in the world that they monitored handwriting, I have no idea. But you used to get a grade for penmanship. And somewhere around third grade, we switched from block writing to cursive. And I thought that would have enhanced my opportunity for getting straight A's because my block writing looked like cursive to begin with. And then my cursive just looked like bad squiggling from a kindergartner, and I just never could get there. And my teacher would say, this is incorrect. The form of your letter is incorrect. You didn't have the right slant. You didn't have the right, I don't know, in the Hebrew they call them jots and tittles. I don't know what you call them in English, but I didn't have the right stuff to make my letters look right. I was incorrect in the way I wrote my J's. If you ever watch me sign papers, I never sign things the same way twice because I always get my J wrong. I just can't write. I'm not a good writer when it comes to penmanship. So we deal with correct or incorrect, right? And when we start to think if it's incorrect, that must mean that it's wrong. And if it's correct, that means that it's right. And all of a sudden, the shift moves from correct, incorrect. No morals attached to that, by the way. That's not moral. To have bad penmanship is not a failure of morality, no matter what my teacher thought. Right and wrong now starts to shift. And what we do, no matter which side we lean on, if someone disagrees with us and we think they're incorrect, we now think they're wrong, and we're adding morality into it. Does that make sense? And once we start to get morality involved, now we start to think of things as good or evil. Not just different. We're not just disagreeing. Now you're evil if we disagree. And this is the space where we live today. We went from a spot of correct or incorrect disagreement to right or wrong, sprinkled with morality. Now it's full blown. If we disagree, you must be evil. You must be on the side of evil and things that are good, because if you were on the side of things that are good, you would be on my side. Does that make sense? And so we start to navigate that. And really, the question in the United States that we have to wrestle with, right? And this is the hard wrestling, is, once you get good and evil, you get to us and them. We talked about that before, right? Like, this is the divided spot. Now we don't want to line up with good or evil. We want to be all good. I've never, except for George Thorogood. If you don't know that song, then I just dated myself for that artist. He was bad to the bone, right? Like through and through, not just bad, but bad, right? And no one wakes up in the morning going, I want to be bad. Like you don't wake up today and go, how can I be evil today? Unless you're Dr. Doofenshmirtz, and that's a whole different reference. But you don't just wake up wanting to be evil. And so to not be evil, I'm going to align my life with things that are good, but who set the tone of what's good? We've allowed our politics to begin to define our morality. And politics were never intended to define morality, ever. Politics aren't about morality. The whole conversation of living in the polis, that's the Greek that gets to us, in the Latin, the polis is simply about the city. How do I live in this space? And the question that we really start to ask, if we could stick right here, we would be far less divided, and Christian witness, I think, would be far stronger. Is it civil or is it moral? So even on the abortion debate, we're wrestling with two different dynamics. The question is it moral and is it civil? And if it's going to be legal, how can it best be legal in a civil way and allow morality to be dictated by the heart, not by the code? So we start to wrestle with these things. Civility deals with being neighborly, orderly, and a functioning society. You can have good civilization in all kinds of governments, by the way. Like, not just in a democracy. You can have people who are good neighbors, live in an ordered system, and have a functioning society and be socialist, communist, live under a full dictatorship, still present monarchies, democracies. You can have civil in all walks of life because the code of your day, the law of your land, is going to define civility. What makes us good citizens is our ability to live into the law of our land. And we'll often take those laws and get so bent over those laws that we think that's defining morality. But that was never the aim of politics. Law in itself was intended to keep order. That's what we do. That's how it's intended for, all the way back to the days of Moses and the code that the Lord gave. So many of those laws are about how we live as citizens. When you go back and you start to read the books of code, Deuteronomy or Leviticus, some of the initial dynamics out of Exodus, this is what it's going to look like to live as a nation where God's in control. Some of that is influenced by morality. And morality really is the pursuit and the embracing of what's good, right, true, and beautiful. Now you go, why do I put beautiful on there? If you start to go back through the history of thought, we'll talk about things in a triune way or a trinity. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. In the natural world, things that are good and right and true and beautiful give witness to who God is. Beauty has its own establishment. And although we can talk about beauty being in the eye of the beholder, when you talk about things like sunsets or a majestic scape of mountains or the incredible wildlife beneath the sea, if you've ever been able to put your face underwater and look for a minute, it's absolutely beautiful. There's no other word for it. And morality really leads us to that pursuit. What is good, what is right, what is true, what is beautiful. Law doesn't do that. And so we start to wrestle with these things and we start to try to codify what's moral when we haven't agreed upon the source of goodness, the source of righteousness, the source of truth, and the source of beauty. In the Christian worldview, you have agreement. But in a pluralistic society, we don't have agreement on where good and right and true and beautiful come from. And we live in a pluralistic society. We don't just have one governing form that tells us a source of this. So when we wrestle with those things, I'm kind of giving you this background because this is where the fight, if you would, begins to happen. Is in this kind of tension between civil and moral. So what we find is that Christians have given themselves, because Christians have a source of what is good, right, true, and beautiful, we have actually sold our positions to a substandard set of yeses in America, and we've exchanged credibility of witness for the posture of power. Let me give you a story here. Anybody ever read George Orwell's 1984? I mean, just casual reading for the weekend, right? So if you don't know, 1984 is a dystopian novel. That means it's a future that no one really desires. It's kind of desperate and depressive. And we're looking down the road at this time. And why he picked 1984, I don't know. But he picked 1984. You could change it today and call it, 2052, and it would probably tell the same kind of story, right? So in 1984, you've got some characters. You've got O'Brien. And O'Brien's kind of a mean guy, straightforward, old guy. He is hardcore. And O'Brien, on the outside, is propagating a resistance against Big Brother. Big Brother is a dictator that is never seen in the book, but his presence is completely felt. And O'Brien starts to interrogate people to help them join the resistance against Big Brother. Well, two characters, Winston and Julia, they convince O'Brien that they are fully ready to give their lives to the resistance. And they go through a series of interrogations, and Winston is telling O'Brien, O'Brien's asking these questions, are you willing to commit murder for the resistance. And Winston's like, yes. Are you willing to do this? Are you willing to do that? Yes, yes. Are you willing to hurt children? Yes. And Winston is just, yes, 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 yes. Whatever it takes to overthrow Big Brother, that I will do. Well, plot twist. O'Brien works for Big Brother. He's not the leader of the resistance. And he arrests Winston and Julia. And in one exchange after the arrest, O'Brien asks Winston, do you really think you are my moral superior? And Winston goes, yes, absolutely I do. And O'Brien just pushes play. And you hear it. Are you willing to commit murder? And it's Winston's voice. Yes. Are you willing to betray neighbor? Yes. Are you willing to hurt children? Yes. And the condemning line says, at the playing of the recording, Winston knew he had lost all credibility. And I feel in our world today, a world that is built on civility, hopefully, is looking at Christian witness and going, you have exchanged credibility for power. And there are plenty of recordings to push play. How a group of evangelical, right-leading pastors could circle around President Trump and pray for him in the Oval Office, and at the same time that group of pastors is absent praying for President Biden, when Scripture says to pray for your leaders. Doesn't matter who they are. Pray for them. How do we make those judgments? And it's being held against Christians in media. A group of select people who were there with a very intentional photograph and a very intentional another photograph 4 years later, not present, and it's being held against all Christians. So what do we do with this? If we're making these decisions and hills worth dying on, like what we have done, like with each yes, Christian witness has become an act of increasing forgetfulness. Because at the end of the day, it's not about the president's office. It's about the king's throne. Now, we have incredible freedom in this. I love the words of Paul. Two passages we're going to look at in 1 Corinthians. One is at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And Paul talks about Christian liberty. Those of us who believe, you have some freedom. He says it so clearly. Everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything builds up. No one is to seek his own good, but the good of the other person. Paul says, eat everything that's sold in the meat market without raising questions for the sake of conscience, since the earth is the Lord and all that's in it. Now, remember, the early church is largely Jewish. They had all kinds of dietary restrictions. Corinth is not a Jewish city. It's a Gentile city. And Paul's going to those of you who believe, go eat whatever's available. God made it all. It all belongs to him. If any of the unbelievers invite you over and you want to go, eat everything set before you. That means, ancient world Christian, you can have a grilled ribeye. But ancient world Jew, you can't because there's fat in the meat and they probably didn't bleed it the right way. And they would fight over these things. Not moral issues, but civil issues. So Paul is heightening this dynamic of freedom. And he says, I do not mean your own conscience, like what's a violation of your conscience. The food is from a sacrifice. Don't eat it out of consideration for the one who told you for the sake of conscience. Not yours because you're free, but for the other person. For why is my freedom judged by another person's conscience? If I partake with thanksgiving, why am I criticized because of something for which I gave thanks? So Paul introduces this tension about how we live in a world that is civilly divided, yet I am submitted to Jesus. In Jesus, I have freedom. In Jesus, I have these opportunities, and we will take that liberty, that freedom, and we will run it to its full extent. And that's what I think often gets us in trouble. When we start looking at the witness, like the key thing right now, today, really isn't who gets the Oval Office. When you look at the agenda of Christ in the world, there is one concern he has. One. And for us, it's to be his witnesses. For those who believe. And for those who don't believe. The desperate agenda of God is for all men to come to a saving knowledge of the truth through Jesus Christ. That's what we're told in Peter. That God withholds his wrath. Withholds his wrath. Withholds his so that God's people could do what God has called them to do. Be his witnesses in the world. And those who live far from him can come close. And we wrestle with it. But what about the person who believes this? Like you cannot possibly be talking about people who support a same-sex marriage, right, Pastor? I can't tolerate that, right? Or what if I know my neighbor is pro-choice? I can't live there with that person, can I? What if this person is all about big business and we're killing the middle class? What are we going to do, Pastor? We start to throw all these different issues out, and we get all frustrated and all angry over all these issues, and we want to take stands on all these kinds of things, and at the end of the day, we really get ticked off at somebody else's morality. And Paul is just saying, like, who are we to judge? And there is judgment between Christians, but not on the restricted. Like if you're in a place, listen to what he says one more time. If I partake with thanksgiving, why am I criticized because of something for which I give thanks? If you believe in Jesus, let me ask you a question. Why are you desperately offended by somebody else's morality? Let's start with that question. If you believe in Jesus, and you can hear what I'm saying, Jesus has a statement about this conversation. Jesus says, why are you concerned with the plank in your brother's eye when you have splinters in or the splinter in your brother's eye when you have planks in yours? And we think that for some reason, the angrier we can get about something, the more likely people are to listen to us. I don't know how it works for you. As a dad, when I'm speaking angry to my kids, and it happens sometimes, I know they're not listening. And you know what question you ask without fail? Are you listening to me? I just heard that. But you're like, why did you do this? And why did you do that? And rah, 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 rah. Are you listening to me? And that's where we live with the world as people who believe in Jesus. We're ranting and raving over stuff. Wah, 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 wah. And the world doesn't hear Jesus anymore. You go look to the life of Jesus, like Jesus never ceases to blow me away. He enters into context with people, and he encounters one moral mess after another. If anyone had the ability to be rightfully angry at anyone, it's Jesus. And he's never taken aback by anybody else's morality, ever. Ever. Jesus sits with the prostitute when she's ready to be killed. And he says, who's left to condemn you? Go sin no more. He sits with a Pharisee who can't stand him and walks him through how to find life. You must be born again. With a Samaritan woman who is in multiple relationships, and not only that, she's also like racially unclean. You know those kind of people, right? And Jesus never is taken aback from her. He just leads her to life. person after person after person after person after person. No matter what the situation, Jesus is never thrown by anyone else's morality. Like when you start to look, and if we as people who claim Jesus to be king can start to live into Jesus' worldview. You ever think about what Jesus' worldview is? Like when he shows up on the scene, Jesus' worldview is that every human who's ever drawn breath is destined for hell outside of being rescued by him. That's the worldview of Jesus, because Jesus is the righteous judge. And he knows that every single person outside of his rescue is destined for hell. And Jesus could have come, showed up on the earth and went, you're going to hell, you're going to hell, you're going to hell, you're going to hell. Had every right to do it. Not one time. Not once. He comes, he lives into people's lives, ultimately dies as sacrifice for sin, and invites people to life. And on this side of the cross, Jesus' people have become the most condemning people on the planet. If you disagree with me civilly or morally, you're evil and you're condemned. And I finger point at you, and may you be judged. It's not what Jesus did, ever. We start to watch this, we start to go, like where this is. Like, on the other hand, we get offended by everything. Like no matter where you fall politically, you get offended by everything. As Christians, that's just what we're known for. We get mad about stuff, and we respond with anger, and instead of doing something about it, we actually confuse our place. Like we talk about things like, well, it's just righteous indignation, Pastor. You know, in the Bible, there is no allotment of righteous anger to humans. We'll claim it all the time. It's just righteous indignation. It's righteous anger. You're actually, that actually belongs to God. Righteous anger actually belongs to God, because here's like the hardest reality. Even in Jesus, you are still wrestling with the convolution of sin in your life. Every good thought I've ever had, although redeemed, is still marred by sin. And that's the good thoughts. I haven't arrived yet. And you're in the same boat. Like we still wrestle with the weight of sin, even though Jesus is constantly shaping us and loving us and building into us his kingdom. Like our role, like when we confuse our righteous anger, we're actually telling God, we got this. And it's not ours to have. It's only his. But all through the Bible, there is an invitation to action. All through the Bible, that God's people would act mostly out of love and truth and goodness. And when we see this, when we confuse anger and action, it actually hurts making things right in the world. There is a current sociology being taken and research done on how we engage social media. You can be so offended, so taken back by something, that if you make a social media post about it, your mind will check it off as you just took action. Like you actually did something really good about the problem that you're facing. If you see something wrong in the world, let's go back to 2020. Mask or not mask. If you said, you got a mask and vaccine to take care of people, and you did nothing about it, you would have thought you took a really good stance and an action to change people's lives. If you made a statement about racism on social media, your body and your mind would have reacted in such a way that you actually did something pro-unity, pro-forgiveness, pro-reconciliation. Even though you didn't go and actually talk to a person of color, the fact that you put something on your Facebook page like makes you feel like that. It's just kind of how we work. Yet we're invited to action, right? Going back to the other passage from Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, we often see this as the passage of like marriage, like love, it's marriage. But it's not about marriage, it's actually just about life. And Paul goes through all these things. If I speak in human or angelic tongues, but I don't have love, I'm just a noisy, clanging cymbal. If I have prophecy and understanding and all knowledge and all faith so that I can move mountains, but I have love, I'm nothing. If I give away my possessions and I give it over my body in order to boast, but no love, I gain nothing. And then we sit back and wonder what happened to the credibility of witness of the Christian church in the modern world. And you go, we've done nothing. We clang and we gong and we argue and we fight and we divide over things that Jesus doesn't. And then you go, what do we do? The church's scorecard over the last decade has proven a desperate need to return to Jesus. Like, I don't care if you're the prostitute on the street or the pastor in the pulpit, the one thing we all need more is more of Jesus. Period. More of him, less of us. John the Baptist says it so beautifully, doesn't he? I must decrease that he may increase. And if churches lived that kind, man, if Cornerstone, forget churches, like if Cornerstone lived that kind of dynamic, where it was less of us and more of Jesus, I would almost guarantee that we wouldn't be able to contain the people who came to him. I was with a group of pastors on Thursday, and they are looking to plant a church in Crystal. And one of the conversations that we got into was how I would feel if a new church was planted in Crystal. I'm like, what does that matter? Right? Like, we need more. More Jesus is better, so long as you're bringing Jesus, not just your gathering. Right? More Jesus is better. And then we started talking, and one of the things that we wrestled with, this particular church has planted churches very well in the southwest metro. So think Wyzetta and that area, Minnetonka, very well, like successful, growing churches. And now they want to plant in Crystal, and they're not for sure their model works. When I asked them why, they said because Crystal's more diverse than anything else we've ever worked with. Right? Not just like in terms of skin color and age diverse, but it is so politically divided, we don't know if we fit. And you just go, when the church echoes that political division, what witness are we giving? Right? So we have to move. Politics, not doctrine, has been the greatest opponent to Christian unity in this country. And we happen to be in a very divided climate. Not just Crystal, but the Northwest Metro is very diverse. You go start reading some demographic pieces, you'll find that it's so diverse. We have to make a move to return to Jesus. So what hills are worth dying on? What if I said none? What if I said there were no hills worth dying on because the only hill worth dying on, someone already died on it? Jesus died on the only hill worth dying on. The only one. And when Jesus died and rose again, he brought the abolishment of sin and death. We, if you believe in Jesus, have to understand the difference between the hills we choose to do battle upon and the hill upon which Christ already won victory. God isn't threatened by our civility or a lack of morality. Nothing threatens him. Jesus walked through this world that was completely resistant to him, completely unthreatened. He never blinked. He just loved people well. And what if for a minute we remembered the King of the Hill, and in doing that, we were able to have faithful witness, where people could see Jesus elevated high. We were filled with rest. Isn't it exhausting to be politically angry all the time? That would exhaust me. We would have rest. We would be unburdened by offense. I had a guy make a compliment to me last week, and he swore in making the compliment. Cool. Most of the time, people get in these conversations, if they swear at me, they'll say, "Oh, I'm sorry, Pastor, I didn't mean to offend you." I'm like, "You didn't." That's your own con. You and God take that up, man. That's not between you and me. Like, how do you live free and unburdened by offense? I get more offended when the Cowboys get a penalty And I'm not even playing the game, Live unburdened by offense and be directed by hope. Be directed by hope. Not on what happens next in Congress. Be directed by hope. Like when we remember the King of the Hill, that's the dynamic of life that we get to live in. Faithful witness, filled with rest, unburdened by offense, and directed by hope. The only hill worth dying on has already been conquered. And Jesus says, come to me and find life.